Good morning. My name is Eric Tonkery, Director of Marketing Education for Rutgers Business School, and it is my pleasure to be meeting and interviewing Dr. Nancy DiTomaso, Distinguished Professor of Management and Global Business at Rutgers Business School. She has written a recent article which is featured in our summer issue of Rutgers Business Review. It's entitled Pathways to Gender Equity in Leadership, More Than a Seat at a Table. It's now more than a seat at the table. And I want to start with our first question is, what is the reference to more than a seat at the table, Nancy?
Well, as you may know, Sheryl Sandberg, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Facebook, wrote a very well-known book several years ago called Lean in which she gave advice to corporate women in terms of how to be successful in their careers. And one of the things that she had recommended was that they should claim a seat at the table. And seems to me that this is not a sufficient solution to gender inequity because it reduces career success to individual striving. And that is clearly not the only issue with which to be concerned. There's much more to gender inequity. And as I describe in the article, there is a context in which women have to operate as they endeavor to claim leadership positions, including a very strong context of sex role expectations in terms of how both men and women believe that women should act or men should act and what's appropriate in their behavior. In addition, there's a structure to the labor market that affects where women are found and how they get rewarded. So I thought that it was important to call attention to the fact that it's much more than claiming a seat at the table if we're going to understand and address gender inequity.
It's a very good point. It almost does sound like it's a conversation starter, but it certainly opened the opportunity to address it. But certainly your paper goes into great depth as if this is just the beginning. And which brings me to my next question is, what are some of the key misunderstandings about the progress toward gender equity that seem to be widespread?
Well, I think there are clearly a number of things that are important with regard to understanding gender inequity, but I will mention just two that I think are particularly important and that which I address in the paper. The first one is that in order to understand what's actually going on in terms of how men and women are faring in the paid labor force, including in leadership positions, we need to take into consideration the full spectrum of women's lives and men's lives. And frequently, when we talk about gender inequity, we don't do that. For conventional reasons, we tend to compare full-time, year-round workers by gender, men and women in full-time, year-round work. But it turns out that because of the responsibilities that women have in the household, the greater responsibilities they have, it's only about a third of women who work full year, year-round, full-time and year-round. And so when we compare that third of women to men, we're getting a false picture. And so the general understanding out there in the media is that women are making approximately 80% of what men are making. But if you take into consideration all women and not just those that are in this subset that are working the way men are working because of issues with regard to household responsibilities, the true figure is more like 49%. So there's a huge gap between 49% and 80%. And that is a huge misunderstanding in terms of really understanding women's lives and how the greater responsibility for the household affects their well-being. By the time they get to retirement, women have many fewer resources than men do. And so this is very consequential. The second thing that I think is absolutely essential to discuss when we talk about gender inequity is that too frequently the idea of a woman is really a white middle-class woman. And the lives of white women and women who are African American or Asian or Hispanic, Latinx are not the same in the labor force. They don't get rewarded the same. And so it's very important to take into consideration what is called intersectionality, that we need to look at the lives of women in the context of their race, their ethnicity, their class, if we're going to understand what is actually going on in their lives. And of course, the same is true for men as well. There's been some very interesting recent research that has documented that essentially gender is racialized and race ethnicity is gendered. And because of that, again, we tend to look at some things and not consider others. And that's very important when you're thinking about gender inequity, because the lives of white women is not the same as the lives of Black women and Latino women, and Hispanic women, et cetera. And so I think that's a key area where there can be a lot of misunderstanding.
Okay, very interesting. Then we had like to follow up with a question on the, which I think touches on what you said in terms of the roles that have been traditionally looked upon between men and women. Why is the fact that men and women typically do different jobs so important to the patterns of gender inequity?
Well, this is what is called job segregation, or the segregation of jobs. And essentially, women's work in the paid labor force is very similar to the work that they do in the household. So they tend to take care of people, to teach people, to nurture people, to do those kinds of things that fall into what might be called care work. And this kind of work in the household is devalued. And so when the same kind of work is done in the paid labor force, it's also devalued. So the kinds of jobs that women do not pay as much as the kinds of jobs that men do. In fact, there was a fairly recent analysis that demonstrated this, in that the top 20, the top 20 highest paid jobs were almost all male dominated jobs, whereas the 20 lowest paid jobs were almost all female dominated jobs. And we talk about male dominated, female dominated, we're talking about those jobs that are about 75% one gender versus another. And so women tend to work in jobs that are paid less, that have less benefits, less opportunity for advancement. And because of this, the segregation of jobs is thought of as one of the key factors that explains gender inequity, and one of the things that is perhaps the most difficult to change in terms of trying to reach gender parity.
Very interesting. Also, your article touches on, discusses two issues that many have said are limiting leadership opportunities for women, including the confidence gap and the lesser likelihood of women to negotiate. What do we need to know about these issues to address the issues of gender inequity?
Well, these are two things that have received a lot of attention in the research literature and in the media over the last number of years. And the difficulty in talking about either of these things, the notion somehow that women have less confidence than men, or that women don't know how to or are unwilling to negotiate, tend to have the danger of putting us into a mindset of fix the woman, which is one of the key explanations that some people give for gender inequity. So the notion is that men are generally found to be more confident, not only in the US, but around the world. However, there actually is more similarity than difference in terms of self-esteem between men and women. So there's actually much more overlap than there is difference. And yet we highlight the difference and not the overlap. And similarly with negotiation, the assumption is somehow that women don't know how to negotiate or are unwilling to do so. And that has something to do with sex role expectations. But in either of these cases, I think we need to reframe it. Some fairly recent research on the issue of the confidence gap acknowledges that there is such a thing. Men do appear to be more confident, but they also call attention to the fact that confidence is not what you are, it is something that you do. So confidence is action, and women can act in ways that demonstrate their competence, and in so doing, enhance their confidence. And so it's not something where when women and men are just different from each other, it has something to do with what they actually do, given their role and position and the expectations around them. With regard to negotiation, there is a fair amount of research that shows that women are less likely to negotiate. If they negotiate, they're likely to ask for less, they're likely to get less, and they're likely to feel less confident in their negotiations. But even in this context, if one reframes negotiation, for example, and puts women in the mindset of seeing negotiation as a way of helping others, it can actually change the outcome. So in each of these cases, these are not necessarily personality things or something that is in the essence of who women are, but it has to do with what kinds of behaviors they engage in and how they understand how they can be effective in their interactions with others.
Very good. I wanted to follow up on the second part of that question about what do women need to know about mentors and others who might be helpful in their careers?
Well, I think the most important thing in the conversation over the last several decades about people who are needed to help you in your career is that there is a difference between a mentor and a sponsor. A mentor is thought of as someone who gives advice, whereas a sponsor is someone who provides opportunity. And it's far more important to get the opportunity than it is to get advice. And so, unfortunately, it seems to be the case that women are more likely to get advice and men are more likely to get opportunity. The other thing that is important to understand in this regard is that whether a mentor or a sponsor, these are built out of relationships that often are reciprocal. So to the extent that the person who is available to help sees that in helping, they also will get a return, then it's more likely that they will step forward and offer that help. And women can have an effect on who is likely to help them. If they take initiative, if they develop unique skills, if they make themselves indispensable, if they make themselves likable, these are the kinds of things that women can do to what Sheila Wellington called be your own mentor. And being your own mentor is probably a good outlook to have when you're facing your career and thinking about the best way to move forward. So one can't always count on having a mentor or a sponsor. In fact, in most cases, these change over your career. There's one estimate suggesting that these relationships may last at best 3 years, maybe even less. And so it's important to not only think about developing relationships with people that for whom you can demonstrate your value and your competence, but also having multiple relationships with these kinds of people and understanding how to manage the relationships so that you're both giving and getting, and to do so in a way that you know when to end a relationship as well as to initiate one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's another question here. What role do men play in addressing gender equity?
Well, it's clearly the case that still, and when we talk about gender inequity, what we mean is that men are disproportionately likely to hold the positions of authority and power in most organizations. And because men are overrepresented in those kinds of positions, for those who want to succeed and reach leadership positions, they need the help of men. So men are very important as advocates, as allies, certainly as sponsors and mentors. And so it's important, if we're going to move toward gender parity, that men are part of that movement and the solution to it. And it's also important to keep in mind that if we take the actions, we collectively take the actions to move toward gender parity, it's good for men and women. It's not just something for women, it's for all of us. A study by the McKinsey Global Institute indicated that both in the US as a country and globally, there is a lot of money left on the table because of gender inequity, and that those countries and companies that move toward gender parity essentially are more profitable and have the opportunity to make substantially more money because of including the contributions of everyone in the talented workforce.
Very good. And my last question is, what ways is an overview of the research on gender inequity in leadership helpful at this time?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of attention to issues of gender inequity, but there also is a lot of misinformation and misdirection in terms of how it is discussed. And because of that, I thought it would be helpful to have an overview that made a point to include the structural, the institutional, as well as the interactional dimensions of how gender inequity gets created and reproduced. We need to get away from the fix the woman kind of attitude and understand what the larger picture is, what the context is, what the levers for change are that will really make a difference. And if we want real change, we need to see these issues somewhat differently. Too often, I think in recent media, there has been almost all attention to the issue of bias. And when they think about the issue of bias, they're saying, well, there are some men who are biased against women. And that's clearly not a sufficient explanation, because there is this larger picture. There's the whole framework of sex role expectations and how they get enacted both in the family and in the workplace. These expectations are built into the kinds of positions that are offered to men compared to women. It is built into how people get evaluated and rewarded and have the opportunity for promotion. So it isn't just about an individual person having bias. It's about the larger framework and context. And I thought at this time it would be helpful to have an overview that called attention to this larger picture. And that's what I tried to do in this particular article.
Okay, well, I want to encourage our viewers to please read, I thought was a fascinating article on, really gives the depth of a lot of the areas we discussed in this interview. Again, it's called Pathways to Gender Equity in Leadership, More Than a Seat at the Table. Nancy, I want to again thank you for your time. This could again be found in the latest issue, the summer edition of the Rutgers Business Review. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.